What up, Cavs Nation? I'm your host, Ethan Sands, and I'm back with another episode of the Wine and Gold Talk podcast. I'm joined by your favorite beat reporter, Chris Fedor. Chris, we're in the off season. How many times have you gotten to play golf so far this year? I'm trying to get into it because we do have a couple subtexters that are questioning what your scores are looking like. So let's get into that real quick.
Look, I've played golf in Ohio one time so far. But I played in Orlando when we were there for the NBA playoffs. It's just I needed to get my life back together first before I got my golf game back together. But I'm planning on playing Ethan a whole bunch at the end of next week and basically through September-ish is when I usually go with my personal golf season. So don't worry about that to the subtexters. I will make up for lost time. But to this point, I've only played one round in Ohio, which is not nearly enough as I would like, but I will make up for lost time, I promise.
Scott in Greensboro, North Carolina wanted to know, what's your handicap, Chris? What you shooting?
This is so funny because this is a conversation that I have with so many people that I play with. They always ask me what my handicap is, and they want it to be official. I don't have an official handicap. I have not registered the way that some of my other buddies have registered. They get on me all the time about it because I just kind of throw a number out there. I make my own handicap based on what I shoot. Most people would say that play with me, Ethan, that I play to somewhere between a 10 and a 12. I always say somewhere between 9 and 11. So I guess we can probably call me a 10 and a half then at that point, right? Because if we're taking the average of both the ways that people view me and my golf game, I think 10 and a half is about right for me.
So I don't play golf for anybody who cares, and nobody probably cares. I'm not a golf guy, even though I've been removed from what I consider my sport to be in baseball for almost 4 years now. I still don't want it to mess up my baseball swing. But
I get it.
I think that the handicap being fluctuated is interesting. I definitely do. And if you have not realized yet, this is another rendition of Hey Chris. We're going to get into some questions from the subtexters to get Chris's insight on a lot of different topics. But we're also going to get into an exit interview type segment where we talk about Darius Garland specifically and talk more about what he needs to do in this next season and whether or not he'll be here for that next season. But Chris, there's a couple things that we want to get into with these subtexters before we dive into Darius Garland, and it centers around Koby Altman to start. So this question from Derek in South Bend, Indiana says, much has been made of Koby Altman's comments about not wanting to trade any of the Cavs' core 4 players this offseason. What are the odds that this is just posturing on Altman's part in case he is unable to find a deal or to drive up the price of any one player?
I certainly think, Ethan, there's a little bit of posturing going on. And I just don't think there's any kind of upside to Koby Altman saying publicly that he wants to trade any of the members of the core 4 or he's willing to trade any of the members of the core 4. It doesn't make any kind of sense for him to come out and say that. The thing that I continue to say is that the Cavs aren't operating under the impression that they have to break up the core 4, that it does not work together. I think they're under the belief of this can still work in the right system, with the right coach, and we don't have to do anything, quote unquote, have to do anything. But if an opportunity presents itself where we can get a package back that makes sense for us to kind of reconfigure the roster, take the next step as an organization, change some things around both offensively and defensively, then we'll consider that. I think that's how the Cavs are operating. The sense that I get is that in past years, they were adamant about keeping the core 4 together. They didn't want to listen to any kind of offers for Jared Allen. They didn't want to listen to any kind of offers for Darius Garland. I think they would be more willing to listen. I think they'd be more open to the idea of moving on from one of those two guys this offseason But I don't think this is an organization that needs to act out of desperation. I don't think this is an organization that had the kind of season that tells them that everything that they have done over the last couple of years is wrong and it's broken. I think if the opportunity presents itself and they get the kind of package in return that would satisfy them, then I think they would listen to that. I think they would explore that. I think they would weigh the possibilities of that. But I don't think they're operating under this impression where they are desperate to make a move and they're desperate to break up something because it doesn't work well enough. Like we've talked about it, Ethan, that there are limitations, we think, when it comes to Jared Allen and Evan Mobley together, that there are stylistic complications at times that show up when it's Darius and Donovan together. But is that to a point so much where the front office is looking at it saying, we have to do something. We have to break up those duos? No, I don't think they're looking at it that way. I think they're honestly assessing it. I think they're evaluating everything related to it. And if they get the right kind of deal, I think they would listen to that and I think they would consider it. But I don't think that they're sitting here today saying, we've got to break up Jared Allen. We've got to break up Evan Mobley. We've got to break up Darius Garland and Donovan Mitchell. That is not the impression that I've been given from teams that have been in conversation with the Cavs this offseason.
I mean, yeah, and we know that Kobe Altman wanted to play his cards to his vest and kind of take the side of the players. Like, we want to have their back. Their contracts are not over yet. We don't plan on getting rid of them. I mean, it's a conversation that has to be had in realistic terms, and I think it's our job to kind of go into the different nuances of each conversation and figure out what is the reality and what was trying to be held close to the vest, so that because we know this Cavs organization is so strategic to the point that JB Bickerstaff, it might have just been JB, but I took it as this being the organization. JB didn't want to announce any injury updates basically throughout the season. When it came to the playoffs, even in the regular season, it came to a point where Chris would ask a question and the answer would already be given before the question was fully given, and the answer was we'll see. That's a distinct, like, a visualization of how this Cavs team likes to operate, and it's showing that we don't know until things happen what's going to happen with this team. We can only make inferences and things of that nature.
Here's the other thing, too. Not a thing that the Cavs can do this offseason can happen without some understanding of what's going to happen with Donovan Mitchell. If Donovan gives them some kind of indication that he is not going to sign a long-term extension, that he's going to play this thing out, then the Cavs start exploring the possibility of trading him, not Darius Garland, right? Then the Cavs start exploring the possibility of trading him and not Jared Allen. But if Donovan says that he's going to stick around long-term, this is the place where he's going to be, this is the place where he is most comfortable, this is the place where he believes he can compete for a championship, then that informs the Cavs' decision-making a little bit better. Then they can start thinking about the possibility of, are we a better team without Darius Garland and Donovan together? Are we a better team if we have Evan Mobley at the full-time five without Jared Allen? Are we a better team with Max Strus playing the two-guard spot as opposed to the three full-time? All those different things the Cavs obviously have discussed in the aftermath of this season, but they can't do anything in terms of actionable until they understand which direction Donovan is going.
And they can't talk to Donovan until later in June. So this is like, we're just trying to figure things out. Yes, exactly. And we're just trying to figure things out as they come up. But it's really just a guessing game at this point. And me and Chris are the ones that don't want to put words in people's mouths. We want to do immediate reporting. If something is told to us, then we will talk about it. But the whole guessing isn't really, I don't think it's my style. I know it's not your style, Chris. But I wanted to go back to this next question, which goes a little bit higher than Kobe Altman. It's a question of how much pressure has Dan Gilbert put on Kobe Altman this summer? As much as JB struggled, the roster has been questionable at best for fit and realistic ability to contend. Is Altman on the hot seat this season if the core four sticks around, but still can't figure it out with a new coach?
Kobe has built up a lot of good faith when it comes to his relationship with Dan Gilbert, the things that he has done for this organization. And I think Dan trusts him. I think Dan respects him. I think Dan believes in him. They've been together more than a decade at this point in time in some capacity. Kobe Altman's the first ever general manager to get a contract extension from Dan Gilbert. And not only did he get a contract extension during his run as general manager, but then he was promoted to president of basketball operations. So I just don't think there's this view within the organization about Kobe that exists from fans that think Kobe should be on the hot seat, that think Kobe hasn't done a good enough job. There are enough positive moves that he has made on his resume that make it so that, he has built that goodwill with Dan. In saying that, his signature move as president of basketball operations was acquiring Donovan Mitchell. All the things that he gave up in order to do that, that was basically his all-in move. If that turns out to go the wrong way, if Donovan decides that he's going to want to leave and go somewhere else, then I think there becomes a lot more pressure on Kobe and the other moves that he makes in the aftermath of that when it comes to how Dan is viewing Kobe, when it comes to Kobe's job security. There were more conversations from people that I had around the NBA throughout the course of this year that were wondering about Kobe and his future and whether Dan was getting frustrated with some of the way things were going at various points throughout the course of the season, especially early on when the Cavs got off to that slow start and they were just kind of hovering around 500. But then they found their footing. Things went the right way. They advanced to the Eastern Conference semifinals. They made the playoffs in back-to-back seasons. So I think those kinds of things certainly help Kobe in the valuation of all of this. But the Donovan piece of this matters greatly, and the coaching hire piece of this matters greatly too. Because the last coaching hire that Kobe Altman made, it was John Beilein, and it was a complete and utter disaster. And he ended up switching to JB Bickerstaff because John Beilein stepped down midway through the season. So this coaching hire is very, very important when it comes to the future evaluation of Kobe. And the Donovan Mitchell situation is very, very important when it comes to the future evaluation of Kobe. I think he's safe enough. I think he's secure enough at this point in time, but that can change quickly if a team starts going the other direction. And now that expectations are higher, now that pressure is higher, now that every move is being put under the microscope, Kobe's going to have to do some more things this offseason and into next season to put some more things on the ledger of pros versus cons.
And I mean, Chris, not to sound like the bearer of bad news or negativity, but Darius Bickerstaff had some good pull in the organization as well before he was let go. Obviously, 5 years compared to over a decade is definitely different. But you look at, and we've said it this season, you never say never, because we don't know what could happen with Donovan Mitchell, don't know what's going to happen with this coaching hire, and that could, like you said, change the objective of this team and what goes on with Kobe Altman as well. But
here's the other thing. A number of people that have worked alongside Kobe or with Kobe in some capacity have moved on elsewhere, gotten promotions elsewhere, and that speaks to how some people around the NBA view this front office and the talent in the front office. And, if you think about it, a couple of years ago, the move that the Cavs made to promote Kobe from general manager to president of basketball operations was in part to open up a new job for Mike Gansey. So he was the assistant GM at the time, but it gave him an opportunity to be the general manager in Cleveland. So he didn't have to go somewhere else and become the general manager somewhere else. So the fact that, there have been other guys that have moved on, that have gotten promotions from other teams, so to speak, that does speak to the depth and the view of this organization in a positive light and the direction that they have been heading for the last 5 years or so. So I just think it's going to take a number of different missteps along the way for Dan to start looking at this situation at the front office as saying, well, this isn't good enough. We've got to go a different direction. I don't think he's at that point yet.
All right, Chris, I think it's time for us to move over to focusing more, narrowing down on Darius Garland and getting into his quote unquote exit interview style thing when we talk about what went on with him this season and just overall grading what he brought to the team over the 2023-24 year. And Chris, it was a tough year for Darius Garland. He was dealing with injuries. He was dealing with still learning how to be the number 2 guy on this team next to Donovan Mitchell. And more than anything, being able to deal with injuries has been something that Darius Garland has kind of had as a common theme for his career thus far. But this year specifically, Darius said that this was one of the hardest things he had to go through, especially when he fractured his jaw against the Boston Celtics earlier this season. He had to get his jaw wired shut, and he ended up losing around 12 pounds because he had to drink food from a straw. Like, just that alone is something that not a lot of players have to deal with, and he did that. But I want to look at some of his numbers, and the one that stood out to me the most is his on-off numbers for the season because of the time he spent on and off the court as much this season. But Chris, on court, Darius Garland only had a 2.1 net rating, and compared to his off court, the Cavs had a 2.4 net rating. So that means that even as it was slight, the Cavs had a better net rating with Darius Garland off the court, although he did bring a lot to the team while he was on the court. What is your interpretation of these numbers? And obviously we'll get into some more as in shooting percentages and things of that nature, but this is just the one thing that stood out to me the most.
I think he had a bad year. And I think sometimes it just comes down to that. And I think there are reasons for him having a bad year. And I think the biggest one was that fractured jaw, it affected him in a different kind of way than I think a lot of people understand. And he was dealing with some personal stuff that I don't think people fully understand either. And none of this is to make an excuse for him, but sometimes there are reasons for why a guy plays bad, or sometimes there are logical reasons for why a guy doesn't live up to the expectations, or why a guy just has a bad year. And sometimes a bad year is just a bad year, and a guy can bounce back from it. So I think, and we've talked about this before, Ethan, obviously I think we can sit here and we can have a full conversation about Darius, his pros, his cons as a player, his strengths, his weaknesses, the things that show up at times in a playoff environment, the things that you question in terms of the fit between him and Donovan Mitchell, the things that you question about his place and whether it should be as firm as it once was when you talk about Cleveland's core 4. Like, all those things are fair game, and I think it's cool to have those conversations because those are the same conversations that other people are having, including the Cavs front office. But I don't think you can tell the story of Darius's season in an honest, fair way without talking about all that other stuff that he had to deal with. And without saying that even though he had some struggles and even though there are clear flaws in his game, the overall body of work for this season in particular, there are logical reasons to think that it was more of a blip and it was more of just a bad year that can be corrected. Look, I have questions about his ability to finish at the rim through contact. I have questions about his ability to consistently draw fouls. I have some questions about his ability to play off the ball and how effective he can be off the ball when the ball's not in his hands. Although the Cavs have numbers that point to him being pretty successful in that realm of offense. But if you're talking about the pairing of him and Donovan long term, part of it's going to be Darius playing off the ball in stretches, Donovan playing off the ball in stretches. And you have to ask yourself, how effective can he be there? How productive can he be there? So, like, all of those things, I have questions about. I have questions about the size of Darius Garland and Donovan Mitchell together in the backcourt, especially defensively. I have questions about Darius and his ability to withstand playoff level physicality, especially if he's going to be targeted by quality defenders like Drew Holiday, Derek White, Jalen Suggs, whoever else you want to talk about. So all of those things exist. But at the same time, you can look at everything that Darius dealt with throughout the course of this season and say that there's logic behind, if you want to call it regression, if you want to call it a poor season, however you want to phrase it, there is a logic attached to that. And I think the Cavs understand a lot of the things that Darius was going through. They were out of his control, and they had some level of effect. To what level? Only Darius truly knows, but they had some level of effect on his performance this season.
Yeah, Chris. I mean, we talked about it yesterday, and the mentality and the mindset of having to deal with that and come back from an injury like that, and then getting hit in the face on multiple occasions, especially in the playoffs against the team that you fractured your face against. Like, there is a mind game that is being played that only Darius understands how difficult it was for him, but also how much he has to work through this offseason to get back to where his mind is at his peak level, where he has the confidence to drive to the paint and finish at the rim. Because there were times, like you mentioned, like you said, there are questions about his ability to finish at the rim, because there were times in the playoffs and in the regular season after he came back that he would stray away from contact. He would go to the rim and kind of fade away while laying the ball up, which could have affected his numbers when finishing at the basket. But Chris, I want to just look at these numbers really quickly, talking about his field goal percentage, which was the lowest it has been since his rookie season, along with his 3-point percentage, which was the lowest that it had been since his rookie season. And he also had just 18 points per game. But the biggest portion of this was his turnover ratio and how much he was turning the ball over. And we knew at the beginning of the season that was going to be an issue. And we thought that it could have gotten better as the year went on. And it did slightly, but not to the level of a all-star level point guard, which we know Darius Garland to have been. And 3.1 turnovers per game, that's too much for a point guard, one. And then also just not understanding how that can impact how the flow of the game goes as a point guard. But I do want to get into some of these questions from the subtexters about Darius. The first one coming from, he didn't put his name, or she didn't put his name. So first one is 3 things I'd like to know more about. Physical conditioning and strength. Obviously framed with the jaw fracture and weight loss you told earlier, but his finishing at the rim is certainly hampered by the inability to score through contact. Is there any chance he can bulk up to fix it? I mean, is weight as much of a, like, if you're throwing your weight into somebody, sure, but like he's not big. Like he's finishing around trees. Like you're not. Go ahead, Chris.
I just think some guys have a certain style that is effective for them, and not everybody can do everything that you want them to do at a high level on the offensive end of the floor. And I think Darius is somebody who his game is always going to be, it's always going to be tied to his craftiness. His game is always going to be tied to his herky-jerkiness, his change of pace. It's going to be more whirling finishes and acrobatics, spinning the ball off the backboard, stuff like that. You know what I mean? Like, that's just the style of player that he has always been. That's the style of player that he's going to continue to be. That's his body. That's his frame. Not everybody is going to be able to finish the same kind of way at the rim. You're going to have to find other ways. You're going to have to continue to tap into the things that can make you special. Not a lot of guys have the stop start that Darius does, right? So it's that's the kind of style that Darius is going to have to continue to lean into, and that's the kind of style of player that he's going to be throughout the duration of his career. And it's all about, you know, how you mask some of those other limitations that he is naturally going to have.
Yeah, Kristen. I mean, this it's funny because this subtexter's questions kind of go into what we had already talked about: turnovers, defense. So I think just quickly, the turnovers. The question is where the turnover is coming from, and there's still a partial lack of maturation from Darius at times. He's sloppy at times with the ball, or tries to go too fast, or plays with his food and ends up making a poor decision with the ball in his hands. But it's I think it's getting better. Like, it's getting better. He's being able to mature in front of our eyes, but it needs to happen faster for him to continue to regain the trust of his teammates and from the organization to keep the ball in his hands while also bringing the ball up and realizing that other players, other defensively prowess players saw what happened in the playoffs and are like, oh, well, if we just guard him full court, like, and he's going to get flustered, why don't we do that partially in the regular season and see how that affects him? But it's a different atmosphere as well in the playoffs and what he was dealing with in that sense. But Chris, is that kind of where you were going for when you think about the turnovers? It's more just him trying to mature as a point guard.
Yeah, I think there's some of that to it. I also think that like Darius has to have some level of understanding of the importance of possession on a nightly basis. I think there are times where Darius plays with a nonchalance, where Darius plays with a level of basketball immaturity, where Darius tries to make the home run pass when he could probably try and hit singles and doubles. And it's something that he's going to have to continue to learn. All of those things are part of the maturation and the evolution of a player. But Darius, just generally speaking, he is going to have to take things a little bit more seriously than what he has shown early on in his career. And if he doesn't, then I think there's probably a ceiling to his style. I think there's a ceiling to him as a player. But I'm willing to give him the benefit of the doubt. I'm willing to understand that there were certain things that prevented him from having the year that he wanted to have, that the Cavs wanted him to have. I think everybody can sit here and say, Darius needs to be better moving forward for this team. Darius needs to be better than what he was this year for the Cavs to become the team that they want to be, and for Darius and Donovan to become the duo that many people still feel like they can become. I think Darius needs Donovan, and I think there's a value to Donovan having Darius as well. But like, if Darius doesn't increase his level of play, then it's just going to exacerbate some of the other questions that already exist with this roster.
And the final question from the subtexter had to do with the defensive aspect. He said that the defensive effort looks better. He certainly doesn't look like either Drew Holiday or Trae Young, but where on the spectrum is he really? Just below average or only better than Trae Young? So I went and did some looking, and for players that are 6'4" and shorter and considered guards in the NBA, when it comes to defensive rating, Darius Garland is 111.4. The other players that are around him at the 111 range are Chris Paul, Pat Spencer, John Morant, Jared Butler, Bones Highland, Fred VanVleet. Like, there's a couple of these guys that you think about that maybe they have a halfway decent defensive presence, but Trae Young isn't on this list. Drew Holiday is also not on this list because of height preferences and things like that. So you got to take those things into account. But Darius made some strides defensively this past season, if I had to say so, because you got to see him take more seriousness. There was times where he had 5 steals in a game, and he was able to do that because of the defensive players that the Cavs put around him. You think about Isaac Okoro, you think about Dean Wade, you think about Evan Mobley and Jared Allen. Those guys make it a lot easier on a smaller guard because, one, you know that you have backup almost everywhere on the court, one. And two, you saw it with Donovan Mitchell. Donovan was able to get into the passing lanes at a better frequency because he wasn't so worried about playing as an on-ball defender, but playing through and getting steals in the passing lane and reading things and being able to use his high IQ to do that. So I think if we're talking about the level of defense that Darius Garland can do, that's another way he can look at Donovan Mitchell and be able to realize what is possible for him on that end of the floor. And I think Donovan can also get better on the defensive end, especially knowing what the Cavs might have on the roster this coming season.
Yeah, I mean, I think when it comes down to Darius, it's not so cut and dry of like, does he fit with Donovan? Does he not fit with Donovan? Do his limitations become too problematic in a playoff environment? I think it's all about like, how do we manage those things? How do we work around those things? And what kinds of stuff could we implement that could make things easier on Darius in the future, better for Darius on the future, better for Darius at both ends of the floor when it comes to the future? And if there's a belief from the organization of like, look, another coach asking different things of Darius, putting him in different actions, using him a different kind of way, all those different things, pairing him up more with Jared Allen as opposed to Evan Mobley, like whatever the case is, I think there is a level of commitment to Darius, provided that the Cavs don't get an offer that, entices them to move on from him. So I do think he is a player that has flaws, but I do think he's also a player that has strengths. And you've seen that throughout the course of his career. And I'm willing to give him more of the benefit of the doubt because I believe that a lot of his struggles throughout the course of this year, Ethan, were more circumstantial than anything. They were more tied to ancillary factors than anything. And that doesn't mean that he's the perfect player. And it doesn't mean that, he hasn't been passed up by some of these other younger point guards, Tyrese Halliburton, Tyrese Maxey, Jalen Brunson, certainly, some of these other guys. That's the place where Darius wanted to get himself to this year. That is the place where Darius ultimately saw his career going. He's still a young player. He can still get better. He can still get to that point that ultimately he wants to get to, with some of those other players around the NBA, with some of those other players in the Eastern Conference in particular. But just like there's no guarantee that the Cavs are definitely going to move on from Darius this offseason because of this, and this, there's also no guarantee that Darius is going to take those kinds of steps, right? We've talked about this so many different times on this podcast. It's going to be up to him. It's going to be up to his development. It's going to be up to whether or not, like, some of the things that have been problematic for him throughout the course of his career or this past season are actually correctable, or if this is just kind of like the package that he's going to come in, and it's about trying to massage it and making it function as best you can while he's here.
And just also looking at these numbers for defense, like you mentioned Tyrese Maxey. Tyrese Maxey actually had a worse defensive rating than Darius Garland this season. So here are some of the guys that had a worse defensive rating that are kind of considered stars still. Kyle Lowry, Patrick Beverley, De'Aaron Fox, Damian Lillard, Jalen Brunson, Kyrie Irving, Tyrese Maxey, D'Angelo Russell, Emmanuel Quickley, Stephen Curry. Like, those are just a couple that did not have a better defensive rating than Darius Garland this season. And you think about it, and it's like, well, okay, he must have been doing something right But I still think there is room for him to improve, obviously, offensively and defensively. And you look at the net ratings of these players, and they'll definitely tell you, like, Jalen Brunson had like an 8 net rating. Darius Garland was 2. So that those are the different numbers that you have to look at. It's not just one side of the ball that you have to focus on. So we're talking about everything when it comes to Darius Garland, especially for this little exit interview of Darius right now. But
there's another layer to this whole thing too, and it's the question of moving forward. If the Cavs were to break up the combination of Jarrett Allen and Evan Mobley, the secret sauce to making their defense so spectacular over the last couple of years, like with one rim protector as opposed to two elite rim protectors, what does that mean for the team's defense as a whole? And what does not having that extra protection mean when it comes to the point of attack defense? And that points to Darius, that points to Donovan, that points to Max Strus, Isaac Okoro, Karis LeVert, some of those other kinds of guys. Is part of the reason why it's been able to function well enough on the defensive end of the floor with two non-traditional, undersized guards at the point of attack who obviously have physical limitations on the defensive end of the floor. Is part of the reason why it's been able to function well enough is because of the protection that the Cavs have with both of those two guys together. It's obviously a tough evaluation. It's a tough question to answer because you really haven't had a lot of data that informs that particular decision, but that's something else that the Cavs have to consider too. It's something that maybe it changes, maybe it doesn't change when it comes to the combination of Jarrett and Evan, but like if that's part of why it's been able to work with Darius and Donovan together, if that's part of why, some of Darius's limitations on defense have been masked, then that's something that the Cavs have to dig into more.
Yeah, Chris, I think that's a huge piece. Like we talked about it at the beginning. Like they strategically made this a defensive-minded team, right? They had Isaac Okoro, they had Evan Mobley, Jarrett Allen, they had those guys together on the court, Dean Wade included, and you would see that's why they would pair Darius Garland and Evan Mobley, Donovan Mitchell, Jarrett Allen. Those things were taken into account, but now as the Cavs look to take a more offensive-minded approach, maybe this next season, depending on the head coach that they go ahead and get this offseason, that could change. And also, like you said, you mentioned if they decide to break up the core, what that means for this defense and how potent it's going to be. Because over the last 5 years, it's been up there as one of the best in the league. How will that change this next season, depending on the decisions that are made this year? But I think the next question comes from Alec in Chicago, and he gets to the point. How does the organization feel about Garland's resistance to shooting more threes? Does he not know that that's the only way to make this awkward fit with Donovan Mitchell work, along with increasing three volume with playing two bigs? Please trade him. Wow. Okay, Chris. we talked about Darius Garland's 3-point percentage being lower than it had been since his rookie season, and he took 6.2 attempts average from 3-point range. The only time he took more was in his all-star season when he took 6.7 in 2021-2022, and he shot 38.3% that season. So it's not like it's a big difference, but what do you think about Alex's question about Darius Garland and needing to take more threes and how that could be the key to making this work? But I mean, I feel like it's everybody needs to take more threes, but we've talked about that in abundance.
Yeah, I mean, Darius has talked about being more assertive, being more aggressive, however you want to phrase it. Darius has talked about his teammates urging him to take more threes, and JB Bickerstaff, when he was still around, he was urging Darius to take more threes. Everybody understands that is something that Darius has the ability to do, and that is something that the organization wants him to do more of. I like the fact that his volume increased I like the fact that he took about 6 a game. I think that needs to go even higher for somebody like Darius, who's capable of knocking down those shots, who's capable of creating space off the dribble. I think part of it can be at times like if you're talking about the spacing on the floor and the opportunities that exist for Darius, think about the difference for him playing against the Orlando Magic in the first round of the playoff series and then playing against the Boston Celtics in round two. There were advantageous matchups. There were advantageous ways that the Cavs could attack the Boston defensive scheme. And when Darius saw defenders in drop coverage, when he saw Al Horford switched on to him, he believed that he had an opportunity to take more threes. He believed he had an opportunity to get to his mid-range game a little bit more. And I think sometimes Darius is the kind of guy who just tries to make the right play as best he can. He's somebody who has tried to get his teammates involved in games early, see if he can get them into a rhythm. Darius is somebody who's still learning the nuances of being a point guard, being an engine driver on offense. Darius is still somebody who is trying to figure out different schemes from opposing defenses and the best way to attack those, all of that kind of stuff. But I focus on the volume more than the 3-point percentage. I think Darius is a good enough shooter. I think he has shown that throughout the course of his career. If he's going to continue to take the level of volume that he did throughout the course of the regular season, maybe even increase that a little bit more, that's only going to benefit the Cavs offense. It's only going to make things easier on his teammates as well, because as you know, when it comes to gravity, when it comes to defensive attention, to me, it's more predicated on volume rather than 3-point percentage. Like nobody was looking at Darius in the Orlando series that was playing for the Magic saying, well, you know, he's not making a whole bunch of shots in this series so far, so we can sag off him a little bit, or we don't have to pay as much attention to him. He has already built a reputation as a guy who can make things happen offensively, who can create his own shot off the dribble, who can break down opposing defenses, a guy who commands defensive attention everywhere he goes. He's a guy who saw more double teams at various points throughout the course of this year. So all of that kind of stuff it's stuff that he has to continue to navigate as a player. He has to continue to work through as a player. And I think there's enough evidence that points to him being a capable 3-point shooter. Now it's just about seeing if he can get that volume up even more than what he did this past year.
All right, Chris, we got to switch gears, man. This is what happens in the world of journalism. When breaking news hits, we got to talk about it, even if it's just for 5 minutes. And now, there is another person being added to the interview list for the Cleveland Cavaliers, Micah Nori, the Minnesota Timberwolves assistant. And what do you think about Micah Nori and his time with the Timberwolves and what he could bring to the Cavs?
First of all, this shouldn't be a surprise, honestly. We reported on cleveland.com last week that the Cavs were going to interview around 10 candidates. They always do as much due diligence as possible. They conduct extensive searches. I think it was like 12 to 14 guys the last time they went through this coaching search, and they ended up with John Beilein. So the fact that, you know, this is just another name to the list, this was a name that was always going to be on the list. This is a guy that has been reported on multiple times for cleveland.com that the Cavs were interested in an opportunity to interview him, and they just needed to wait for some things to fall into place. And now they got that permission to do that. And this is somebody who makes a lot of sense, right? He's been an assistant coach a few different places. He just got an opportunity to step in for the injured Chris Finch and kind of learn a different role within the coaching staff, if you would, during this playoff run for the Minnesota Timberwolves. And I think it's somebody that people around the NBA, Ethan, feel like is ready for a head coaching job at some point. So the Cavs will talk to him. They'll see what his strengths and his weaknesses are. They'll see if he's ready for this opportunity to go from assistant to head coach. But this was always somebody that made a whole lot of sense from the Cavs perspective. And it was always somebody that they had an interest in sitting down and having an extended talk with. It was just about trying to make it all line up. And there are going to be more names that come throughout this process. You can bank on that.
And they just had to wait to see what Timberwolves were going to do. And if they got to the next round, they would have to wait even longer. But now that that series is wrapped up, the interview process for Mike Nori is set to begin with the Cleveland Cavaliers. But with all that being said, that'll wrap up today's episode of the Wine and Gold Talk podcast. But remember to become a Cavs insider and interact with Chris and me by subscribing to Subtext. If there's any breaking news that happens throughout the day, this is probably the first place you're going to hear it. So sign up for a 14-day free trial or visit cleveland.com/Cavs and click on the blue bar at the top of the page. If you don't like it, that's fine. All you have to do is text the word STOP. It's easy, but we can tell you that the people who sign up stick around because this is the best way to get insider coverage on the Cavs from me and Chris. This isn't just our podcast. It's your podcast. And the only way to have your voice heard is through Subtext. Y'all be safe. We out.